For my project, I will be discussing John F. Kennedy's presidency. During the presidential election of 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon faced each other in the nation's first televised debate. The candidates answered questions from journalists while many people watched at home. During the fall campaign, Kennedy promised to stimulate the economy and reform education, healthcare, and civil rights under his program, The New Frontier. He vowed to lead the nation to victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Unlike Nixon, Kennedy was Roman Catholic, and his campaign dealt with accusations that his loyalty to the Pope would trump his loyalty to the United States, but he promised he would always put country above religion. John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th president on January 20th, 1961. He became one of the youngest and the first Roman Catholic president. In his inaugural speech, he spoke of the need for all Americans to be active citizens. He said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." One of the first things President Kennedy did was to create the Peace Corps. Through this program, which still exists today, Americans can volunteer to work anywhere in the world where assistance is needed. They can help in areas such as education, farming, healthcare, and construction. From the start, Kennedy gave foreign policy top priority. On April 17, 1961, Kennedy approved a group of Cuban exiles that landed at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba in an effort to overthrow Fidel Castro. The mission failed, and President Kennedy took personal responsibility for the defeat. In October 1962, President Kennedy dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war when Kennedy insisted that Nikita Khrushchev remove the 42 missiles he had secretly deployed to Cuba. The Soviets eventually removed the missiles, and the crisis ended. President Kennedy was also eager for the United States to lead the way in exploring space. The Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in its space program, and President Kennedy was determined to catch up. He said, "No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space." Kennedy was the first president to ask Congress to approve more than $22 billion for Project Apollo, which had the goal of landing an American man on the moon before the end of the decade. President Kennedy was committed to an aggressive space program. The Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in the space race by launching Sputnik, an artificial satellite, in 1957. Since space technology demonstrated potential weapons, this competition became an important aspect of the Cold War. On February 20th, 1962, astronaut John Glenn aboard the Mercury craft Friendship 7 and became the first American to orbit the Earth, but Kennedy did not live to see his dream come true when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in July 1969. On August 13, 1961, East Germany began constructing a wall between the two sections of Berlin. In June 1961, President John Kennedy met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, Austria, but the conference failed to resolve the long-standing conflict over the status of Berlin. The Berlin Wall ended the movement of East German citizens into West Berlin. Kennedy sent a force of 1,500 troops across East Germany into West Berlin. While largely symbolic, these actions demonstrated to the Soviets that the United States was committed to supporting West Berlin. Both the United States and the Soviet Union allowed the city to remain divided and limited their action to protecting their sphere of Berlin. The resolution of the Berlin crisis represented the end of an important point of conflict in the Cold War. President Kennedy had to deal with many serious problems here in the United States. The biggest problem of all was racial discrimination. Many civil rights leaders didn't think President Kennedy was supportive enough of their efforts. The president believed that holding public protests would only anger many white people and make it even more difficult to convince the members of Congress who didn't agree with him to pass civil rights laws. By June 11, 1963, however, President Kennedy decided that time had come to take stronger action to help the civil rights struggle. He proposed a new civil rights bill to the Congress, and he went on television asking Americans to end racism. President Kennedy made it clear that all Americans, regardless of their skin color, should enjoy a good and happy life in the United States. On November 21, 1963, President Kennedy flew to Texas to give several political speeches. The President and First Lady had gone to Texas in an attempt to bolster Democratic support for his presidency in the South. While the President and First Lady were riding in a motorcade with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, the open limousine turned into Dealey Plaza and gunshots rang out. Kennedy had been shot in the neck and the head. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital. A short time later, President John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Within a few hours of the shooting, police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald and charged him with the murder. President Kennedy's death caused enormous sadness and grief among all Americans. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Washington for the president's funeral, and millions throughout the world watched it on television. President Kennedy dealt with many situations throughout his presidency. He dealt with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, the space race, the Berlin Wall, and he even created the Peace Corps. President Kennedy was known for his leadership, personality, and accomplishments. He was always optimistic about the future and believed that people could solve their common problems if they put their country's interests first and worked together.